as we think about the sort of immediate post-World War II era, one can't help but ask the question of what were the lessons we learned in the interwar period between World War I and World War II that guided the choices we made during and after World War II, particularly in the building of institutions?
We learned that you can pull the world together and it can work. Let me give a little history. At the end of World War II, some gifted people with names like Atchison, Marshall, and Truman looked back, and what did they see? They saw 2 world wars. The first settled in rather vindictive terms that helped lead to the second. They saw 51 million people were killed in the Second World War. They saw the Holocaust. They saw the Great Depression with the protectionism and currency manipulation that aggravated it. And they said to themselves, what a crummy world. And we're part of it, whether we like it or not. So if they set out to do something, make it something better. We've all heard of Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was not the U.S. telling people what to do. I think there were 44 countries at Bretton Woods. So there was leadership and ideas, and out of it came what amounted to the IMF and the idea of getting controls of currencies, having some idea about that, of trade, open trade, the GATT. The World Bank was then called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and helped in that kind of thing. So there was an economic dimension. And then came the Cold War. So there was NATO, and in between the Marshall Plan. And NATO worked. And over a period of time, at least in the US, and with working with our allies, gradually things took shape. And in the US, it was fundamentally nonpartisan. That is, there were problems, and we argued about the problems, but the arguments were on the merits and not about partisan politics. It was a different atmosphere. I might point out that our INF agreement was ratified by the Senate 93-5. Our 1986 Tax Act was passed by the Senate 97-3. So these are not partisan things. These are things you ended up agreeing on. So these things happened. And as the Cold War came to an end, I think it was fair to say that there had been created a lot of participation all over the world, a security and economic commons, and everybody benefited from it. Our problem right now is that commons has fallen apart. And so we're struggling. We used to have sensible ways of doing things, and they're beginning to atrophy. So we've got ourselves to get back up and make it work again.
And so we still have these highly effective, or well, I should say, we still have these structures of the United Nations, of the IMF, of the World Bank, NATO, of course. But a lot of the problems we face require political will as well. It's not just a process or an institution, but political will. Do we have what we need in place to manage issues like climate change, cybersecurity, nuclear proliferation? In other words, those problems that no single state can manage on its own.
That is a big problem, and you have to have good governance in each individual state to be able to deal with the international problems that they have to interact constructively on. In the field of energy, I think we're at an unusual spot because we now have plenty of oil and gas. We know how to liquefy the gas. And OPEC's ability to cut production and raise prices, the rug has been pulled out from under that because of the resilience of the fracking technology. So the energy picture has changed in the sense that we have energy that is there and secure. We have national security problems we don't have. I remember the 1973 Arab oil boycott and the problems it caused, no more. And we have all the tools we need to grapple successfully with the environment. All the tools we need. Let me give you an example. There's a huge amount of R&D being done at universities. I'm most familiar with Stanford and MIT. But we've had a sustained effort by the part of gifted scientists and engineers working on this. So by now, electric panels are terrific. The solar power is here. I have solar panels on my house at Stanford, and I've long since paid for them by what I've saved on my electric bill. I have an electric car. The panels produce more electricity than my car uses. So guess how much my fuel costs me, Jane?
Minus something.
It's zero. How about, what's not to like about that? Anyway, so, but I talk to the battery guys around Stanford, and they say, look, car-level batteries are going to get very soon smaller, better, more sustainability and mileage, more mileage between chargers, cheaper. And they're already up to 230 miles between charges. So I say the electric car is here. Yeah. It doesn't need subsidies. It's going to be there and available, and that's a big deal. And there are many other things like that. So if we can keep the R&D going, the holy grail is getting to be large-scale storage of electricity. Mm-hmm. Once you have that, you take the intermittency problem out of solar and wind, and you also, from a national security standpoint, recognizing our grid is so vulnerable, you have a little insurance policy by that storage. So there are all kinds of things being produced, and we got to keep that going. So I think that's a problem that we need to, but the one I worry about the most are nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapon, a modern nuclear weapon dropped anywhere around here incinerates the Bay Area. It's gone. Or Beijing, or Moscow, or New York, or wherever. They're so powerful you can't imagine. And I fear that people have forgotten that. I remember the Chernobyl accident, big accident. And I was fascinated. The first meeting I had with Gorbachev after that accident, I found that he had asked the same question I had. I said, well, here we have Chernobyl. Suppose a nuclear bomb had been dropped there. What's the comparison of the damage of that? And it's not even close. The nuclear weapon is so much more destructive. So Gorbachev and I both, by that kind of exercise, you get it into your gut how powerful these things are. And you remember during that period, we advocated big reductions, and in the end, we got them. And so the number of nuclear weapons today is about a third of what it was at the time of Reykjavik. On the other hand, things have turned. We have proliferation and careless talk about the use of nuclear weapons. Bill Swing, who was here, where are you, Bill? He wrote a wonderful thing that I tried to get published before the election, but for some reason it didn't get published. But he goes through various things, but the end is, when you put your hand on the Bible and swear to be President of the United States, that's the least of it. It's when you put your hand on the nuclear button, you're no longer president, you're God. Who can press a button and kill 1 million people? That's not a president, that's God. And somehow we've got to get a hold of this, and we're not doing too well.
So we'll go further a little ways through our conversation about the kind of the dark side of the post-war era. And definitely get a chance to talk about innovation, since everyone on this panel is part of the innovation economy. Bill, but I want to take you back to the Marshall Plan days. When you think about how extraordinarily foresighted it was to move from a world in which you tend to isolate and punish your enemies, and instead, your former enemies, and instead decide to embed them in a larger sort of security and economic order. But it wasn't obvious back then, when your father was both a champion of the Marshall Plan and the man responsible for its implementation. What was the atmosphere then? What were the attitudes toward what he was doing?
Well, if you'll forgive me for, I think my father, by the way, would be very thrilled to be on the stage here with you, George Shultz. He is my hero, as I've told him before, in public and private. And so to follow him on a question that big, I think I'm going to go a little light on that. And I would just say that the Marshall Plan, in my view, had several elements that are very American. And one of those is the ability to help others. Second is the thrill and the sense of accomplishment to really do help others. And finally, the objective to get something done and do it well, and completing all of those are very American. And the Marshall Plan, it seems to me, epitomizes those three things. So it's a very American plan. And it carried out, Germany, I happened to be over visiting my father, who was at that time the economic advisor to General Clay, who was the Tsar of Germany during the occupation. And I saw with my own eyes the Germans digging their way out in this was maybe 1948, and still digging and putting their Berlin back together. To see that, it makes me realize that everything we can do to help others in need, if we've got the ability to do it, is so important, and it helped me to get into the nonprofit world and found Draper Richards Kaplan, which helps nonprofit organizations get started in the earliest days. And I think the Marshall Plan, my father ran the Marshall Plan out of Paris, and the reason I'm here in San Francisco, I think, is because Averell Harriman, who ran it from Washington, suggested that my dad get a deputy, and he got General Fred Anderson, who was running the 8th Bomber Command. There was 12 O'Clock High was a movie about the 8th Bomber Command and 8th Bomber Unit, and Anderson and my dad worked for about 3 years in Paris, overseeing the Marshall Plan in Europe, and they became great friends. So my dad, being an investment banker background, but he always had his eye on the venture capital actions that the Rockefellers and the Whitneys in New York had, and in Boston, General Dorio founded American Research and Development, and those were the only three that I knew of, that he knew of, I think. And and they both, Anderson and Draper, knew about Northern California and how great the weather is. And so they both decided they'd start a venture capital company here. Draper, Gaither, and Anderson. Rowan Gaither was the Gaither in there. Jim Gaither, many of you know, is son of. And so his father and my father started that up. And of course, it's been a great play. And I came as one of 5 young guys to play, to pretend that we knew something, but basically we were doing the grunt work for the 3 seniors, and it was a great experience, and it led me. I stayed with it for about 3 years, and then started my own venture capital company, and Silicon Valley has just emerged since that time, and it's been an incredible thing, and that's a perfect lead into you.
Well, I do want to ask you one question, because I had a chance to chat with your daughter, Becky, and with others who...
Becky's here.
Yep, Becky's here. And with other folks who knew your father way back then. And what they tell me is that he was extraordinarily charming, charismatic, and persuasive. And I suspect that's why things went, and you're a little bit of a chip off the old block, I have to admit. But you think back then, I mean, before the Marshall Plan, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, had argued for something very different, right. for basically ensuring that Germany would never build an industrial capability again.
That's exactly right.
And that was embraced during the war by both Churchill and FDR. So this is an earlier day. So it just shows what your dad was up against. But
yeah, because my dad definitely took the other point of view, being economic advisor to Clay. He understood that that's what we did wrong in World War I. Basically, we penalized them so much that it led to World War II, I'm sure. So that was exactly right. He took on Morgenthau and argued strongly and won. And today, Germany is one of our great friends, and certainly lucky that it's not an agrarian state, which it wouldn't have stood for very long, knowing a few Germans that I know.
But he had he had logic on his side, right, for that. But he was also a magician. I don't want to suggest he used sleight of hand, but I've learned that he worked his way through NYU as the motorcycle magician.
That's right.
Tell me about that. How did that skill set come to play in his later diplomatic career?
Well, Berlin was divided up in 4 parts. Russian, the British, the French, and the American. And so they'd have these meetings, and my father represented the United States at those meetings. And the night before, they had a dinner or something, and my dad did these magic tricks. He was really good with his hands, and things disappeared behind your ears, and he was really good and entertained all through his life, business life as well as diplomatic. And so, but the Brit had not been at the at the dinner. So the next morning, they had official meetings, and they made little speeches to introduce something or other. And the British man got up and said to the Russian, directly speaking to the Russians, trying to convince them of something. Now, we want you to know that we have nothing up our sleeves. And the Russian burst into laughter, and the Brit didn't know what was going on or why everybody was laughing. That's the story about his magic tricks in diplomacy.
So Kathy, when during the war, during part of the war effort, not only did we build institutional capability, but also a capacity, but also some technology capacity, some industrial capacity. How did that get put to use at the close of the war?
Well, it is a fascinating story, and I'm actually working on the book project I'm working on at the Air and Space Museum right now will pick up roughly at that point. So World War II ends, thank heavens, thanks to the good work of gentlemen like your father. And all of a sudden there is all this surplus stuff. There's surplus hardware, airplanes, rockets, V2s. There's surplus talent, everything from aircraft mechanics to rocketeers. And quite a conversation, actually a remarkably well-organized conversation in some respects at the highest levels of the US government about what do we do with all of this? You can turn and walk away. You can find some way to redeploy or reinvest. But if you think about it, where had there been any use for submarines prior to World War II? None. Where had there been any proven civilian uses? None. How about sonar? None and none. How about rockets? None and none. How about airplanes? None and none. So you have all this stuff against a backdrop of a trying to recover civilian economy, the only not devastated country really on the planet. And a couple things come out of that. Space science starts out of that. Everything we know today about doing astronomy from space or looking back at the Earth from space starts from that. It starts from the fact that there are captured V2 rockets that we've reverse engineered to learn the lessons from. And now it's sort of, well, anybody got any ideas of something useful we could do with these? Other than, we can cut them up into razor blades, but is there something else? James Van Allen out of Iowa comes along with a group of bright folks and says, there's a couple things we've never been able to do before. We've never been able to look back at this planet from that kind of, we all know the metaphor of the high ground, but my goodness, we've never been able to look back at this planet from that kind of high ground. These things can let us do that. Only a couple minutes at a time, but they can let us do that first time ever. And the other thing is, there are these things out there called stars. One of them is our sun. And our atmosphere is a blanket that covers our planet, and it doesn't let everything through that they shine at us. We can only see in certain windows. So there's a lot of things we don't know about the sun and stars, and we can only know them if we can get some instrument out of the atmosphere. So those simple notions with some very clever instrumentation design that, again, had never been done before, and a huge amount of trial and error. These were not highly reliable machines. It was really a weird idea for a scientist to spend their time in building an instrument that had a 1 in something bizarre chance of succeeding, because the craft you were going to put it on is actually a bomb. A bomb, if it behaves well, is called a rocket. And if it doesn't behave well, it's called a bomb. If you're going to be an astronaut, you need to understand this very clearly. So those are the halting first steps of space science, and they were very, very halting. So that's one I'd highlight. And I could tell a similar story about underwater acoustics and our current understanding of the three-dimensional structure of the ocean. I could go through countless fields. You can tell the story of the airline system that brought me here from Washington today out of that same surplus story. Two gentlemen named Juan Trippi and Howard Hughes looked at a couple million pilots and engineers and navigators coming back with the addicted a bit to flying and all this surplus hardware that had been built, that the United States government was happy to have someone pick up at 10 cents on the dollar if they could think of something useful to do with it. And they competed to organize the first something resembling an airline system. Juan Trippi won with what became Pan Am World Airways. Howard Hughes lost with what eventually nonetheless became TWA Airlines. And off we went. So modern air travel as we know it got its boost first from World War II, and the cleverness, the financial wherewithal, the daring of our financial institutions, and the technical cleverness of entrepreneurs like Hughes and Trippi and Van Allen to make something of these odd things that were left over from a very different undertaking. And the final thing we got is, every ounce of technology that fuels Silicon Valley, every ounce of technology that you all have in your pockets and on your cell phones at home, the technology that makes our cars more highly computer intensive than an Apollo capsule was, all of that also really came out of the boost of World War II, because we also had a pattern of investment in science that hadn't ever been done before. We had a talent base in the World War II mobilization. And again, bright leaders in government. I don't think we were quite as burdened with the notion then that intelligence and wisdom and cleverness is in the private sector and only stupidity is in the government sector. It was, in fact, quite the reverse. The best and brightest minds, the Bill Drapers and many others, flocked to the war effort and flocked to the governance of the Marshall Plan and those institutions. It was where excellence was, and it emanated out into the rest of the country. So clever minds like Vannevar Bush looked at this scientific infrastructure we had, which now was no longer needed to figure out an atomic bomb, or to figure out how sound goes through the ocean so you can find submarines, or to figure out how to control systems so you know where to lead a gun and shoot down an airplane. And they asked the question, with all that capacity and all that talent and all that ingenuity, what are the problems of society? that this enterprise could tackle. And that is how the scientific enterprise that, ladies and gentlemen, created life as we know it today in this country, that is how that was born.
So, Bob Metcalfe is one of those innovators. He gave us Ethernet just as a beginning, and now teaches innovation. I'm going to, though, before turning to Bob, ask you a question, because you're describing a world in which we made the investments with a purpose. The initial investment, the purpose was advancing our security. There are other situations where
security and well-being.
Well, this is where, and so security and well-being, we've made investments for the purpose of advancing our prosperity. But are we making the investments in discovery that are open-ended, that just say, look, set this scientist running? Because we know that when you go in search of the solution to problem A, you end up learning the solution to problem B, right? It's never, that's the nature of discovery. Are we making those kinds of investments now?
We're at a very different point in time and a very different era now. Among the lessons I think those leaders took from World War II were that up against big challenges that you're wise enough to know that you don't fully know the nature of this big challenge, but that it's momentous. It's important to try to tackle it and solve it. How do you do that? And the answer was not you lay out a project plan. The answer was you get the best and brightest minds you can, and you let them loose. So that investment philosophy was a bet on individuals' investment philosophy. It was not some random walk of curiosity. It was a curated effort, but it was basically bet on individuals. That has, over time, with various political and financial pressures and, in my opinion, an overdone and somewhat fake notion of accountability and metrics, we're hyper about accountability and metrics, and what that means is you will get only what you only knew in advance you wanted. So nowadays, I often use a metaphor of hunting and farming. The World War II science investment and early thereafter was farming. It was set good folks forth, give them light and water and nutrients, and they will come up with things. And if you read the report that really established our science establishment back in 1948, it says, it allows, it expects, and it tells us this is the way to do it. It's a general diffusion model from the cleverness of those people back to society. It's not a demand and response model. Henry Ford famously said, if I'd been working in the climate of today, I wouldn't have been allowed, I would have no way to have created a car. I would have been told to make a faster horse.
Yeah.
So we tell lots of people nowadays to go make faster horses. And what we ought to be doing is letting more and more people loose to find out what the thing beyond the horse is.
Yeah.
But that requires a shift in philosophy back to, I'm talking about government investment here. I think venture capital and private foundation dollars can adopt different investment philosophies. But the shift from the early philosophy of the public monies invested in research, which really was more, let them run to the frontier, count on the diffusion, have the patience. This is your patient capital investment, this is your farming investment, this is your hunting investment. You want them both. They are not the same. Yep. Don't treat them the same, don't measure them the same, don't grade them the same. Don't expect them to look and act the same.
So one of the things that happened after World War II, Bob, was that the Europeans seeded a bunch or created a bunch of government institutes for the purpose of undertaking research and innovation. And we in the US did something different. We invested in private and public research universities. You've been somebody who's been a real advocate for the research university being at the forefront of change, being where innovation happens. Say something about your thought process and your experience, both at MIT and now at UT in Austin.
Well, thanks to what all the infrastructure building we've just heard about, I lucked out and arrived in the 60s and went to these things called research universities, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and got to work on federally funded research, which ultimately led 48 years later to the internet. So lucky me, thank you very much. By the way, I pitched you in 1980 at Sutter Hill Palo Alto Square. Do you remember your offices
Oh, yeah.
there? Yeah. Now I think of you as part of the infrastructure.
Where did you
Congrats.
pinch me?
What floor of Palo
No,
Alto?
where on my body?
I better not go there. But anyway, so through that experience of having watched startups out of the startup infrastructure from research universities, I'm now a firm believer in the efficacy of the research university and the connected to startups. And the real reason why research universities seem to be the best idea is they produce students. And I've observed the best advocates of new innovation are students, that is, the graduating students in possession of the technology that they've just co-developed with their professors, and they become the best advocates, champions of their technology.
And you've argued they're the source of the best startups, is that right? The students.
Yes, well, you know, there's a great deal of variability in many different cases, but Main Street is students out of research universities are extremely effective advocates of innovation.
Now, what you've said many times, and anybody in Silicon Valley or in Austin or Cambridge would say is it takes an ecosphere for it to go from a great idea, go from sort of discovery to an innovation to a technology to a business, right? What does that ecosphere need to look like, and what are you guys doing down in Texas to create that very ecosphere? I know that you and your wife Robin have, for example, given grants to professors who might take an idea to market.
So my mission at the University of Texas is to help Austin, Texas be a better Silicon Valley. So what I'm trying to do is copy MIT and Stanford as quickly as I can and install it. And Austin's pretty far along, so it's not as if they hadn't thought of it before. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to encourage. We have 3,000 faculty members. Very few of them start companies, so I'm trying to encourage them. Students don't need any encouragement. The trouble with students, especially undergraduates, is they don't know anything. And it's hard to start a company if you don't know anything. But if you're a professor, you probably know a lot. And guess what? Every professor has a flock of students organized around them. So I have been focusing on that axis, is encouraging professors to start companies. And not to leave the university to start the company, oh no, but to produce the students who will then found the companies that will take their technologies forward.
And so you need that infrastructure, though, of investors, of venture folks. You need the legal basis that government provides, the intellectual property protection, et cetera.
I should have called this the Draper ecology, but I call it the Doreo ecology instead. And that's just a coastal thing. I was just on the East Coast and I thought of it. But there are in this ecology, there are 7 species. There are the research agencies like DARPA and NIH, and then there are the research professors who take that money and convert it into new knowledge. There are the hopefully graduating students who become the champions of that technology. There are the venture capitalists, angels and others who finance it. There are the scaling entrepreneurs who know how to build companies. There are the strategic partners who partner up with little companies and help them accelerate their growth. And ultimately, there are the 7th species are the early adopters, God bless them, who are willing to buy products from startups.
Yeah. So, and Bill Draper has taken very much that same model and said, how can I apply that to philanthropy? How can I apply that? If you're looking for one kind of change, you're looking for social change, Bill. But isn't it very much along that same thinking?
Right. As venture capitalists, we take all the credit for any good deals. But the truth is the entrepreneur is the one that you really have to back on. So I pay a lot of attention to who it is that's going to run the operation, and have they looked at the technology? Do they know it cold, or do they have somebody by their side that does? Then can they get along with people, and can they attract a good team to lead, and are they curious, which is an unusual part, but have they ever asked us venture capitalists about ourselves or how we look at things. Because if they're not curious, they probably don't know what's around the corner that might slam them when they first get started. Things like that.
So this is a kind of leadership. Secretary Shultz, you mentioned when we began, you talked about a little bit of the dark side of the post-war era, and that's the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. You played a role in two really key pivot points during the Reagan administration, both in the Cold War. We were seeing the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and in the nuclear arms race. For the first time, a president talked about nuclear arms reductions as opposed to limitations, which was sort of a managed way to keep going. You were at his side. You were at his side in Reykjavik, where he not only agreed to the denuclearization of Europe, but also even talked about the elimination of ballistic missiles. He was way ahead of the teams at DOD who had to write this up. Tell me something about that. Help us picture the table in Reykjavik, but also what your reaction was and your views are now in retrospect of the kind of bold statements that were made at that powerful moment.
It was a fantastic two-day meeting. And we agreed in the end we ought to have a goal of eliminating nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. But President Reagan was very insistent that we stick with our effort to have a strategic defense initiative that is an ability to cope with ballistic missiles. And I remember at the very end, Gorbachev asked him, he said, "Mr. President, if we eliminate ballistic missiles, why do you need a defense against them?" And he said, because people know how to make them. There'll always be some rogue country that comes along and gets one, and then you and I will both be glad that we have a defense against them. A very prescient remark. And Reagan said, and we'll share our technology with you. And Gorbachev said, Mr. President, you won't even share milk technology with us. So that's where we broke up. But an awful lot had been accomplished, but there was one thing that hasn't been publicized that was very important. My assistant secretary at the time was a woman named Roz Ridgway. She was terrific. And we had two negotiating groups in the night between the 2 days. And one was chaired on our side by Paul Nitze, who was the arms control stuff, which turned out to be very good. But Roz chaired one on other things. And she got for the first time an agreement with the Soviets that human rights would be a recognized regular item on our agenda. The fact that she could get that was a tribute to her skills, but also it gave you a little insight on what was going on inside the Soviet Union. It was the first time they agreed to anything like that. They always said, it's none of your business. So that was a big, important meeting, and it was sort of stunning to sit there and listen to the proposals that Gorbachev laid on the table, all of our negotiating requests, and it bowled everybody over.
So one of the most dramatic things said was at one point, this notion of eliminating ballistic missiles, and that was heresy to those of us who weren't there, right? We'd never heard of such a thing. And of course, ballistic missiles go very quickly. The opportunity for miscalculation is huge, whereas with cruise missiles, you have enough time to find out what's really cooking.
You don't have a lot, but you've got some.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you get a whole half hour. but that was really a remarkable proposal. I think it was not sufficiently understood because it didn't end up being pursued. But to just the sense, I think you cannot overestimate how large a departure that meeting was from anything that had come before. So let me take you to the wall, the Berlin Wall. When Reagan said, tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, we talk about what President Reagan was thinking and doing. But what about Mr. Gorbachev? What were his aspirations for the Soviet Union and for the Warsaw Pact? Didn't he kind of know that it wasn't working? What was he aiming for?
Well, I think he was aiming for a rearrangement of the world arrangements. And he gave a speech at the United Nations. He volunteered to come and give it toward the end of December in 1988. And I went to the speech. And he said, we're going to withdraw troops and tanks and so forth from Eastern Europe. That was the headline. That's what the press all got. But I thought there was something much more profound. He said, we have to have freedom of choice around the world. He basically said the Cold War is over, and hardly anybody got it. But I said to him, that was a remarkable speech. That was the part that I picked out. But that was the end.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask each of you to imagine we've come back for the 100th birthday in 30 years, and tell us what you think the world will look like then, or what you would most like it to look like then. It's awkward to ask Secretary Shultz because he's been around such dramatic change that your standards are very high here. But let me give you a shot at it.
Well, I think the world is going to be quite different. And we have to understand why and learn how to cope with it. We have the information age. People know what's going on right away, everywhere. That means that you can't ignore or suppress diversity. You've got to learn how to govern over it. And on the whole, people don't. I think we do a reasonable job here. It goes right back to our Constitution. But it's hard. Second, artificial intelligence is really moving, big time. And so it will enable people to do things that have never been done before. And then you have something called 3D printing. It should be 3D manufacturing. It can manufacture very inexpensive, small, lethal weaponry. You don't have to be a government to get it. That's very destabilizing potentially. But then they are able to produce a lot of things near where you are that you want. So I think there's going to be a deglobalization element here to this technology. So we have these technologies that are coming along that are going to make us change a lot. And I think people say, well, how do you deal with it? Well, there are all kinds of things we're trying to work out and think about. But I think the basic thing is we must have people in government who have vision and who are trusted and who know how to govern in a substantial way. It's going to be a key. We can find those people.
Bill, 30 years from now.
Well, I had one heck of a time driving here. I think there'll be some improvement there. I hope so. I think there'll be, if any of you have been to the Tesla plant over across the bay, it's extraordinary. I mean, you get in a little cart and drive around, and the beginning of some aluminum is at the beginning. And by the way, you see, well, there's a human being, one maybe, and it's all mechanically done. And
Robotics.
Out the other end is a Tesla. Perfectly painted, everything. So that's going to eliminate a lot of jobs that a lot of people rely on. I am an optimist. You can't be a venture capitalist without being an optimist. And I think that what will happen is that there will be more jobs of a different type, but we've got to work on the education side, and I don't think we're there yet. We're not in the class we should be as Americans. We're behind many other countries, and I think a lot of work has to be done on educating every element in society so that we're prepared for these changes.
Kathy.
So I think about the planet. The space age started a pretty dramatic shift in our relationship to the planet, symbolized by that iconic Apollo 8 Earthrise photo, but so much more than that. I mean, we are all the first generation of human beings that have the ability to actually take a snapshot of the planet in a scientific sense, measure the state of its conditions around the whole globe essentially simultaneously, and thanks to the information age and supercomputing, to convert that into reliably actionable information about what a likely future state will be. We call the everyday version of that a weather forecast, but it has many other incarnations. We're at the dawn of that era of being able to really deal with information about the planet and its state in this kind of way, to know what's coming and have a sense of it. So I would hope that 30 years from now, our ability to really take the pulse of the planet and factor that more wisely into decisions across the whole fabric of society would have changed. In my worldview, and I think this maybe gets, I don't think I came to this by being in space, but it certainly crystallized from being in space. Our economies and our society depend on the ecosystem, on the environment. It's not the other way around. So, this is a spaceship Earth. It is interconnected in countless ways we hardly think of on a day-to-day basis, well beyond the capital flows and the physical asset flows that make the global trade system. And I hope that 30 years from now, that knowledge and understanding has woven through the fabric of our society in a way that has really wrought another step of fundamental change in our relationship to the planet.
Bob.
You chose the 30-year thing to make it really hard. You should have chosen 70. Isn't this the 70th?
Okay, you can go for the 7.
Well, 70 is much easier than 30. 30 is, well, the internet is 48. The transistor is as old as World Affairs.
That's right.
Invented in 47. And that has accounted for almost all the change that's occurred. But I think, since you asked, and since you didn't give us any preparation, so we had to just come up with this.
Yeah.
And I'm often wrong, and people write about how wrong I was. So we'll be nearly immortal. We'll be immortal if we want in 30 years. We will have solved energy. It will be abundant, cheap, and clean by then, easily, I think. Solar, fission, fusion, things like that. We will not spend 3 years learning Russian. We will, as I did, we will upload it into our heads and learn Russian in a few minutes, I think. Let's see, is that enough yet?
Except for be studying Mandarin.
But the real big progress is we will have fully eliminated departments of motor vehicles.
I have to say, I'm the one person here that got his license taken away because I had an accident. And so I went to the DMV and parked the car in front of another car on the DMV property. And as I was backing up, I did bump into the car behind. And there is a guy taking a picture and yelling at me. And he went inside, and another woman came out. She owned the car. He didn't even own the car. And they're both yelling at me. And so I think I'm the only person ever to have had an accident on the DMV property.
And if I remember this story correctly, the owner of the car worked for the DMV to boot.
Oh yes, definitely. They both did. They both did. So I flunked that test. It took me quite a while to get my license back.
So Secretary Shultz wanted to have a last word.
I just wanted to have one follow-up little example. Yesterday, I spent the day at a meeting about energy down at Stanford, and had about 6 students come and give presentations. And they talked about things that you almost didn't think of. But one of them said, "I'm Canadian, and all Canadians love hockey. And we all love the great one, Gretzky. In most hockey games, everybody goes where the puck is. The great one goes where the puck is going to be." So he said, in batteries, everybody is talking about lithium. I'm going where the puck is going to be. It's aluminum. So wait for the aluminum battery. Who knows?
Let me just close by saying that Bob Metcalfe made a prediction about the internet, I think it was many years ago, and it turned out to be, this is why you can take some of our predictions with a grain of salt, turned out to be not exactly right. And so he, being an honorable man, decided to eat his words. And in a speech before something like 1,100 people, or something, it was a speech before a lot of people, he took the page on which he had written his prediction, tore it up into little bits, put it in a wearing blender with a little bit of something liquid, and ate your words. So you get the award for the most honorable among us. Please join me in celebrating our four honorees.